Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP US History as we talk about perhaps the most divisive election in American history, the election of 1800. In 1860, the Democrats were split. The Northern Democrats, hoping to preserve the Union by continuing to serve as a national party, as opposed to the purely Northern Republicans, supported the little giant, Stephen Douglas, hoping this Westerner would be acceptable to North and South. But Southern fire-eaters despised him for opposing the Lecompton Constitution and suggesting to the Freeport Doctrine that popular sovereignty might end up stopping the spread of slavery. And so, at the Democratic Convention in Charleston, Southern delegates stormed out, effectively ending the convention before a candidate could be chosen. Northern Democrats met on their own then in Baltimore, where they did nominate Stephen Douglas. Southern, feeling that their fellow Democrats had gone behind their back, Southern Democrats convened a rival convention in the same city and nominated their own presidential candidate, John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, a future Confederate general. There was another group as well, made up primarily of Southerners who wanted to save the Union, although certainly some Northerners as well. Principally old Whigs and Know-Nothings whose old parties were gone, but for one reason or another did not feel they fit into the Republican Party. In particularly Southerners, but there were certainly Northern members as well. And they hoped to also hold the country together under the Constitution. And they too met in Baltimore and chose John Bell of Tennessee, once a Jacksonian Democrat, but no longer. I'm selecting him in a very narrow vote over Sam Houston of Texas. For vice president, they chose Edward Everett of Massachusetts. Bell had once been a Jacksonian Democrat, but then became a leading Whig in Tennessee and a free soil man in the 1850s. The Constitutional Union Party members went through the country ringing bells for Bell, campaigning for Bell and for the Union, the Constitution, and the enforcement of the laws. Those laws, of course, including the Fugitive Slave Law and other laws protecting slavery. Now, William Henry Seward had felt that 1856 was not a Republican year and had declined the nomination of his party for the presidency. But 1860 he thought was different. And at the Republican convention in Chicago, Seward, the most prominent member of the party, expected to be nominated. But his appeals to a higher law than the Constitution had made him seem subversive, and his belief in abolition, as opposed to simply being a free soiler, made him seem dangerous and excessively divisive, even for the Republicans as a whole. And there were other choices. One was Salmon Chase, the governor of Ohio, a man who, and what I'm sure is the closest he ever got to a joke in his life, said he hated his name because it was too fishy. But he was an even more outspoken abolitionist than Seward, and he was one of those anti-slavery Democrats who had helped form the Republican Party, but most Republicans were former Whigs, and they didn't trust a former Democrat. Edward Bates of Missouri was less radical, and it was hoped might appeal to some Southerners and Midwesterners being from Missouri. He was seen as less radical, but he had offended some voters from the Upper South by wanting to limit slavery, even if he wasn't an outright abolitionist. Also, he had once been a know-nothing, and so he was unpopular with German Americans, who were a very important part of the Republican Party in the Midwest. There were other candidates with support in their home states, most notably Simon Cameron of Pennsylvania. And so Abraham Lincoln was nobody's first choice, but he had few enemies in national politics, could attract valuable Midwestern votes, and was chosen as the candidate on the third ballot. The vice presidential candidate was Hannibal Hamlin of Maine. The Republican platform was free soil, free labor, free men, meaning containment of slavery, a protective tariff which was felt to help not only factory owners but factory workers, a higher price for the owner, allowing him to pay a higher wage to his worker. They promised to protect the rights of immigrants, a promise meant to overcome the legacy of the Know-Nothings in the party. They promised a transcontinental railroad to link the East to the Pacific. They promised internal improvements of other types and free homesteads to settlers in the Great Plains. Southerners, though, feared that Lincoln would try to end slavery immediately and without compensation. In fact, Lincoln was a free soil man. He was not an abolitionist. Although he hated slavery, he did not feel he could constitutionally end it, and certainly felt trying to do so would create a national crisis. Even near the end of the Civil War, he was considering creating a fund to reimburse former slave owners for their slaves when they were freed. However, Lincoln's reputation among Southerners was that he was simply a black Republican, a dangerous abolitionist out to steal their property. Many Southerners threatened to leave the Union if Lincoln were elected in the election of 1860, seeing him as a purely Northern candidate out to hurt the South. Indeed, Lincoln was not even on the ballot of most Southern states in 1860. And here we can see a depiction of all these men. On the far end, Abraham Lincoln fighting with Stephen Douglas over the West, both tugging on their home state of Illinois. Down here in the South, John C. Breckinridge threatening to tear that part of the country away. John Bell, at least, trying to glue the country together, although not, it seems, with much success. Voter turnout in the election of 1860 was 81.2%, the highest in American history to that point, the second highest overall. And of course, Lincoln won the election of 1860, although with less than 40% of the popular vote, the worst a winning candidate has ever done. Still, his votes, over 1.8 million, were concentrated in the North, giving him control of the Electoral College, far more votes than all his opponents put together, 180 in total. Stephen Douglas came second in the popular vote, over 1.3 million popular votes, but his, unlike all the other candidates, were spread across the country, and so he barely won any electoral votes, coming in fourth, with just 12. John C. Breckinridge carried most of the South, 848,000 popular votes and 72 electoral votes. Bell carried only 3 states in the Upper South, including his home state of Tennessee, getting just under 600,000 popular votes, 39 electoral votes. And if Douglas, Lincoln's closest competitor in the popular vote, and either of the other 2 candidates' totals were combined, they would have beaten Lincoln in the popular vote. However, due to the way electoral districts were distributed, Lincoln still probably would have won most of the North, and thus the majority of electoral votes, even if all his opponents had combined their efforts into one party, or so historians who have looked at the county-by-county voting returns have done. If you're curious, Washington County, Tennessee, to my surprise, voted for Breckinridge. I would have taken us for a Bell County. And, of course, had all of his opponents worked together, things might have gone differently in other ways. But as it is, Lincoln won with an overall majority in the Electoral College, but a minority of the popular vote. Again, the least popular successful presidential campaign, since John Quincy Adams in 1824, whose election also made many people unhappy. And again, Lincoln won with only Northern support, showing the South that the numerical superiority of the North was so great, the North would be able to push around the South whenever it wanted. Or so many Southerners felt, although most Southerners did not hate the Union as a concept. Indeed, Bell, Breckinridge, and certainly Douglas had all run to preserve the Union, each hoping to hold the country together in his own way. And the South did still have a majority in the Supreme Court. They made up almost half the Senate and were a sufficiently large part of the Union that a constitutional amendment to abolish slavery would have been impossible because it could never have gotten 3/4 of the states to ratify it. But still, the purely sectional victory of Lincoln, demonstrating the power of the North, the supposed threat of the anti-slavery movement, and certainly the Republicans' anti-slavery movement. Decades of insults or perceived insults from the North, and of course concerns about the Republicans' plan to raise tariffs, made Southerners, who by nature are kind of touchy anyway, and badly on edge after John Brown's raid, certain that Lincoln, or if not Lincoln, somebody else in his party, if the higher law Seward or Salmon Chase or some other was later elected, might end slavery, and even if Lincoln himself did not. And Lincoln was elected in November of 1860, but would not be sworn in as president until March 4th of the next year. And the long period between, the South had time to react. December 20th, at 11:15 in the afternoon, South Carolina dissolved her bonds with the Union, reasoning that South Carolina had always been a free and sovereign state, only allied with the other states as long as it was in her best interest to be so. With the election of Lincoln, it seemed obvious the North had turned against the South, and even if Lincoln was not plotting against the South, the next Republican president might be. There were those who questioned South Carolina's wisdom, saying South Carolina was too small to be a republic, although too large to be an insane asylum. In response to this national crisis, President James Buchanan did nothing. And the long period between Lincoln's election and his inauguration, 6 more southern states seceded. In January, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana all left the Union. In February, Texas did so as well, against the advice of Samuel Houston. And these 7 states sent representatives to Montgomery, Alabama, where they created a provisional constitution and government for what they called the Confederate States of America, seeing themselves as fighting for the independence of an American people. George Washington is in the center of the Great Seal of the Confederacy, and being seen as a Southern hero, as well as an American hero overall. They chose as their president Jefferson Davis, hero of the Battle of Buena Vista, a former congressman, senator, and secretary of war. Alexander Stephens of Georgia was named the vice president. And they created a provisional constitution closely based on that of the United States. In response to this crisis, President Buchanan did nothing. Some opponents of secession wished for, 1 hour of Jackson, Andrew Jackson not having put up with this sort of thing. But there were those Northerners, including President Buchanan, who did not feel it was morally correct or legally proper or certainly personally appealing to keep the South in the Union by force. Nothing else invading the seceding states might anger other southern states into leaving as well. At this point, while 7 slave-owning states had left the Union, 8 had not. Buchanan, a lawyer to the end, said that as he understood the Constitution, it was a permanent document and the states had no right to leave, but also, he said, the Constitution did not give him as president the power to stop the South by force of arms. Had Buchanan acted then, despite this debate, there might not have been a war, or a relatively quick one had there been. Although the U.S. had a very small army at that point, which the South might have been able to hold off, and invasion of the seceding states might have encouraged more to break away from the Union. Right or wrong, President Buchanan did nothing. Some of his advisors and many other Americans still at this late date hoped to compromise. A Kentucky senator, John J. Crittenden, proposed a compromise of his own that he hoped would keep both sides happy. In the Crittenden Compromise, he suggested the old Missouri Compromise line again be extended west until it hit California, a free state. And any territories in existence or acquired in the future by the U.S. government north of that line would be free, and anything south of it would allow slavery as a territory. When a territory was ready to join the Union, it could then decide through popular sovereignty whether it would be slave or free. But Northerners did not approve. For all of the Crittenden Compromise passed, Southerners might turn south, again try to conquer Central America or the Caribbean islands. Lincoln said it was essentially a declaration of war on South America. Southerners, though, resented this because it could still keep slavery out of many territories, and they assumed a free territory would then choose to be a free state. And the Supreme Court already said that no place was really a free state. And, of course, Lincoln rejected the Crittenden Compromise. And he was willing to use force to bring the South back into line, although he hoped he could make the South seem like the aggressor. The Deep South left the Union for many reasons. There were unquestionably economic issues. The South was one of the largest importers and exporters of goods, making the tariff a vital issue. Slaves were clearly a valuable source of property the South could not afford to lose control of, either economically or socially. The South felt threatened by things like the attack on Harper's Ferry, Nat Turner's rebellion back in 1831, which some blamed on abolitionists. Many were angry at the North's failure to comply with the Fugitive Slave Act. Indeed, the deliberate violation of it in many cases. And the Northern treatment of John Brown as a martyr. And King Cotton remained so profitable, Southerners had come to feel they could make it on their own, that they no longer needed the North, which was just passing tariffs and other laws meant to hurt the South. The war would be fought over many things, and over states' rights to govern themselves, over tariffs, and over the expansion of slavery. But in a deeper sense, these disagreements came back to the differences caused by the different systems of free labor and slave labor in the South. Slavery was always an economic threat to Northern factory owners and Northern factory workers, as well as to small farmers in the West, especially once Southerners began looking to spread to the West and began using slaves in factories in the South. So, while it's very popular to say the war was over states' rights or the tariffs, and it was, those would not have been such powerful issues, probably not issues worth fighting over, had not been for the underlying issue of slavery. So the war was maybe not about slavery, except it really was. Although others have still looked for yet more faults. Some have blamed the second two-party system. Either the second two-party system ultimately failed because it fell apart over slavery. If it had managed to hold together with two national parties willing to compromise, maybe things could have been worked out yet again. Or perhaps the second two-party system worked so well in addressing all the other major complaints that slavery was the only thing left to fight over. Mark Twain, of course, claimed the South had read too many novels by Sir Walter Scott and become convinced they were a new race of knights, medieval lords of the manor, fighting for their power to control, to rule that ancient way of life. Regardless of the reason, or many reasons, two American peoples who had so recently been one people went to war with one another between 1861 and 1865, killing 2% of the American population in the process.